Okay, there's a lot of things that I see in movies that I'll probably never experience in my personal life. Like, I'll never go through a car chase in a major metropolitan area or pull off a major heist involving every hot Hollywood star I can think of, even though I'd be down with that. And I've never survived a plane crash or even had a plane crash.
For me, I always think about having to choose between cutting the blue or red wire while defusing a bomb.
Yes, or taking the red or the blue pill.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's true, we end up, faced with a lot of life-threatening events in the media, or in entertainment. But I never really know how I'd respond if I did get into one of those situations. Even though cutting the blue cord and having a bomb not go off does sound really badass. But what happens after the movie ends? And in real life, if you've survived a traumatic experience, it's not something you can just forget, move on unaffected.
That's why we're speaking with Carol E. Miller today. She knows what it's like to actually live through a plane crash. Obviously, it was an incredibly traumatic event that required really intense physical and mental health care. Fortunately, over time, she did get the care she needed, which is so good to hear.
The first time I did EMDR, it felt like standing in a dry riverbed and all of a sudden this flash flood comes along and just sweeps me off my feet. And I had no notion that it was there.
Imagine you're flying in an airplane. You're 16 years old. Life is pretty normal. You're in high school. You're on a small airplane with your mother, your father, and your little sister. Your dad's the pilot on this quick hop from Maine to Massachusetts. You look out the window. The world looks a lot more manageable when everything is so small, so far below. There's a little turbulence, but you don't think it's anything to worry about. It's a small plane, so you feel every vibration of every air pocket. It's also cold up here. You ask your dad if you can turn on the heat. Another jolt. You settle into your seat. You think you're almost home. And then it all goes wrong. And that's all you remember. I've been really trying to take my self-care game to the next level this year. And part of my self-care routine is making sure my hair looks fantastic 24/7, 365. Because having fresh hair color is just one of those little things that does help me feel my best. But since I travel a lot, I don't always have time to spend hours and hours in a salon. And that's why I love Madison Reed. Madison Reed is reinventing the way women color their hair. It's the quality of salon color, the convenience and affordability of at-home hair color, and it's an ammonia-free formula with ingredients that you can feel good about putting all over your head. You don't have to sacrifice the quality of your hair color just because you're short on time. With Madison Reed, you can get gorgeous, Italian-made, multi-dimensional hair color delivered straight to your door on schedule for less than $25. And if you're worried about picking a color online, don't be. Madison Reed makes it super easy. Just answer a few quick questions about your hair and you'll be finding your perfect shade in no time. Head to madison-reed.com to find your perfect color today. iSurvivor listeners will get 10% off plus free shipping on your first color kit with promo code SURVIVOR. That's code SURVIVOR at madison-reed.com. From Wondery, I'm Jenna Brister.
And I'm Wagatwe Wanjuki. This is iSurvivor. On our show, we tell you about the attacks, the assaults, the manipulation, the fear, and the triumphs. About the people who fought back, who won, and who rise above their experiences every single day.
I've never been in a plane crash. Have you?
No, I've been in really turbulent planes. That's it. And that's nothing compared to actually going through a plane crash. So this is totally new ground for me.
It's not something you can just forget, brush off.
Right. And that's why we're speaking with Carol E. Miller today. After we hear from Carol, we'll talk to Dr. Steve Danziger. Dr. Steve is a specialist in a kind of therapy that helped Carol recover after the crash.
Here's our interview with Carol E. Miller.
So we were actually flying home from a visit with relatives in Maine, and we got within about a mile of the runway. And what had happened was there was a carbon monoxide leak in the cabin of the plane. There were 4 of us in the plane. My father was piloting, as you said, and my mother was sitting next to him, and my 12-year-old sister was sitting next to me. So I was not conscious for the actual crash, but we crashed in a residential neighborhood. The plane came down through some trees, and that clipped off the wings. And then the nose dove into the ground in the backyard of a house. And the plane just kind of dug a furrow across the lawn of that house and started to flip upside down, and the tail came to rest on the back porch of that house. That was one aspect of it that was, I guess, a good thing, because had the plane flipped all the way over, we would have been crushed inside of it. My dad was the last person to pass out, and he passed out right at the end. And he and I basically traded places in the crash. So I went forward and smashed my face into the windshield, and he went backwards into the cargo hold. And my mother was able to drag herself out of the plane, and I was not. My dad was trying to get me to do that, but when the plane partially flipped over, my arm was trapped underneath, so I was pinned in there. And my 12-year-old sister she had her seatbelt on, and that is what they think killed her on impact. It just bit into a main artery and severed that, and she was killed quickly. At least we hope that was what happened, that it was quick, for her sake, certainly. It took a while for the paramedics to find us, and when they did, the other 3 were taken out of the plane quickly, but because my arm was trapped, I was in there for quite a long time. It was about an hour. I was pretty out of it. I mean, I remember sort of vaguely hearing my father's voice asking if I could move my feet, and then when he saw that I could, urging me to get out of the plane. The main concern was that the plane was going to blow up because there was fuel everywhere. But then eventually I started to regain consciousness, and there was a police officer who had crawled in with me and was talking to me and trying to figure out where my arm was and how they could get me out of there. The surgery team was on scene preparing to amputate my arm when the firefighters were able to cut open the fuselage of the plane and pull me out. I mean, it really felt like a lifetime passed.
So that's Carol's account of the plane crash. She survived amazingly because she didn't put on her seatbelt.
Now let's hear how life changed after the crash.
Strangely enough, when all was said and done, I didn't have really any injuries. No broken bones. I had some gashes on my head, and I looked pretty horrible, but no internal injuries, no nothing. And my parents, my mother was very close to death for about 2 weeks after that. And my dad was in the hospital for that long as well, and I was in for a couple of days, and then I was released because there was no reason to keep me. I was separated from them in the hospital, and I was allowed to go visit them very briefly before I left the hospital, but then I was living with somebody else for several weeks. And as you can imagine, that was a pretty difficult experience to be separated from my parents. So once my parents did get out of the hospital, they had a very long convalescence. And, I was the only one at home with them. And so it fell to me to kind of take care of them, which was not a great situation to be in as a 16-year-old. And there was no conversation about what had happened, how we were dealing with it. There was no discussion about maybe we should get some help with this. It was just a very bleak, not talking, kind of, we got to tough it out sort of situation. So I really didn't get much of any help in terms of just trying to understand what was happening to me and, what was happening to all of us and what to kind of expect as a result of this experience. And I never heard terms like survivor guilt or PTSD or anything. So 3 years after the crash, and I had been in college for a year, and I went to see a therapist because I didn't understand what was happening to me, but it was sort of typical symptoms of PTSD. I mean, I couldn't sleep, I was having flashbacks, I couldn't concentrate, I felt totally isolated and numb. And I also felt intensely guilty for having survived. And so the therapist was really not helpful. She told me I was mildly schizophrenic and didn't explain what that meant. But one of the things she said was I should go home to my family and orchestrate a family conversation where we all talked about our feelings about the crash, which sounds good on the surface of it, but in the context of that conversation, my dad told me that he wished that I had died instead of my younger sister. And so I was already feeling like this was my fault. I had asked him to fly us that day, and I had also asked for the heat to be turned on, and that's how my dad said, the carbon monoxide got into the plane. So I already believed that, I had killed my sister. And then to be told that I didn't really deserve to be alive, I mean, from that point on, I just lived as if that were true. I really believed that I didn't deserve to be here, and I sought relationships with people that confirmed that belief so that I could be told over and over again, oh yeah, you really are kind of a piece of shit and who doesn't deserve to be here. And that's how it went for 20 years until I finally got into therapy and got help.
So 20 years after that, what kind of treatment did you enter into?
Honestly, I was really therapy averse because I had had that very bad experience with therapy in college. But I was in a relationship, and that was a condition that my partner put on me, was maybe he wouldn't leave me if I went into therapy. So I hightailed it into a therapist's office, and she spent about 6 months trying to convince me that maybe the plane crash did have something to do with the fact that I was practically catatonically depressed. But I wasn't having any of it. I was just saying, well, that happened in the past, that's over, let's focus on now. She was in a consulting group with a group of other therapists, and they talked about my case. And a couple of them said, well, she sounds like a candidate for this treatment called EMDR. That stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing.
And then did you just jump right into that treatment, or what was your intro into EMDR?
I was really reluctant because, it sounded to me like desensitization and reprocessing sound like I was going to be brainwashed, turned into a zombie or something, So I was very wary. I did a bunch of research that didn't really help me. This was in the early 2000s, and there wasn't a lot of material out there for people to read about it. But I decided to go and meet with this therapist and talk with her about it, and she reassured me that it wasn't going to suck my brains out of my head or turn me into some kind of
vegetable lady.
Yeah. So I was really afraid to do it, but I decided to give it a whirl. It was the thing for me that turned everything around. It just completely transformed everything for me. I went in there believing, as I told you, that I did not deserve to be alive. And after 14 sessions of EMDR, I knew that that was completely baseless, and I was starting to feel things again, to feel myself, to sort of get glimmers of joy.
For folks who don't really know what EMDR is, could you just explain? I know there's different techniques. What did you do specifically?
The way it was developed initially was the eye movement part of it. There's something that happens when the eyes move back and forth. We do that in REM sleep, and that's a kind of self-healing mechanism that the body has that allows us to process things that have been difficult during the day. So EMDR uses that same kind of mechanism, but you're in a wakeful state and you're focused and you're working with the therapist and you're focused on a particular memory or emotion. So for me, I actually used sound instead of eye movement. So I put on a headset and it was connected to a device, and my therapist would turn it on and this electronic tone would ping from one ear to the other. And that created the same kind of cross brainwave pattern that moving your eyes back and forth does. And there's something about that allows access to those traumatic memories that our psyche keeps very, very heavily guarded and locked away. When I was listening to these tones and focusing, it started off with start telling me about what happened the day of the crash, and we would go through that story over and over again. And listening to the tones, it all became so real and so visceral. I could feel myself trapped in that space again. And the first time I did EMDR, I think I bawled for 45 minutes straight, like rivers of snot coming out of me. It was just like all of this has been dammed up inside of me for all of this time. And the first thing that we did to close out that very first session was, again, while listening to the tones, my therapist said, just tell yourself you can never be back there again. You'll never be trapped in that place again. You'll never be in that danger again. And I was thinking oh, right, that's going to do anything. But I went along with it anyway. And my whole body just received that like a promise. It was amazing. I left that office and I went out on the sidewalk and I realized that I was whistling. It was just a really powerful turning point for me.
And so do you still do sessions, or is it something that you commit to, work through, and then you're just done?
I still use it from time to time in my therapy. I've seen how useful it is to me, but I don't have to go back over the same material. That's what the reprocessing part of EMDR is there's this story that you've been carrying around about yourself for all of this time and these negative beliefs. And what we're doing is we're substituting those with different beliefs that are really based in reality instead of based in the feelings and emotions around the trauma. It's not like you have to go for checkups. Once it's done, which is really a lovely thing about it too.
And your husband is a practitioner.
He is.
Is that right? Oh, do you guys meet in the office or?
It's so funny. He always says, I was not her therapist.
Disclaimer. Yeah. But that's a really great thing to be able to connect on.
Oh, totally. We met online. When I told him that I was writing a book about EMDR and my experiences, we had about a 3-hour conversation the first time we talked on the phone that was all about that, because it was so much a part of both of our lives and real point of connection.
Learn more about Carol E. Miller's story in her memoir. It's called Every Moment of a Fall, a memoir of recovery through EMDR therapy.
We all know it's really hard to not only get through the day, but be your coolest possible self if you did not get a right amount of sleep the night before. And if I'm being totally honest, I think the last time I got a good night's sleep was probably in the womb. But the folks at Casper felt the same way, so they decided to design products that help you get the sleep that you deserve, so you could be your best you. Doesn't that sound amazing? Casper products are inclusive and comfortable for everyone. They're cleverly designed to mimic human curves, providing supportive comfort for all kinds of bodies. Hey, yo! So whatever you're working with, Casper's got your back, literally. Their mattresses have a breathable design that keeps you cool and regulates your body temp throughout the night, which is a great feature, especially in the hot summer, or if you crank up the heat at night. And Casper also offers a wide array of other products, like pillows, sheets, etc., to ensure an overall better sleep experience. All designed, developed, and assembled right here in the U.S. Are you not totally satisfied? Casper has got your back and offers a hassle-free return and a 100-night risk-free Sleep On It trial. Guys, that's longer than most relationships. iSurvivor listeners can get $50 towards select mattresses by visiting casper.com/survivor and using promo code survivor at checkout. That's Casper.com/SURVIVOR, promo code SURVIVOR. Terms and conditions apply. That is really incredible, though, to thinking about how much of it was still locked inside that many years later after the crash.
Yeah, it reminds me of like just how often people say, oh, I try to bury it, try to move on, and it just doesn't leave. You gotta fix that shit. Like you can't ignore it.
Absolutely. And every family is so different, but also probably very similar in that, you know, my family is one of those too. They're great and very loving, but we don't really sit around and talk openly about traumas. You know, and that can be very healing, especially their entire family was involved in this. And then to afterwards, no one talks about it. No one's like, oh, we should go together and deal with this insane thing.
Yeah, I think that's why professionals are so important, because you do need to learn the right way to kind of talk about it, or at least the right way to recover and heal and discuss it and process your own stuff. So yeah, I'm happy that she was able to finally find it. But I think we just are so ill-equipped as a society, right? Like, because like learning how to talk about your feelings is actually a skill. And I know I had to teach myself that in different ways.
Yeah. And being open to getting help and to what that might look like. When I got hit by that Uber when I was driving my scooter, I found myself doing all sorts of things besides selling it to a guy in Laguna Beach for $1,000 off Craigslist. I tried acupuncture, which really helped, and essential oils, chiropractic, obviously. I mean, I would love to do EMDR therapy. It's cool to see that it's one tool, but it is a really valuable one for people who have been through, you know, that event trauma.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, because I heard a little bit about it, and only first from a friend who has been having really treatment-resistant trauma, and she was telling me about it, and I was like, that sounds so weird. But like, it sounds weird enough that I was like, oh, it probably does really work. Like, you know.
Yeah.
I hope there's more access to it, because it seems like it's growing, but it's kind of like a new field. I asked a few friends about it, and they're like, oh, I would love it, but my insurance doesn't cover it. And so it seems like access might be the next big frontier, hopefully, with EMDR, at least for us.
Since not all insurance companies cover EMDR, we invited an expert and a practitioner to join us, Dr. Steve Danziger.
Dr. Steve is a psychotherapist who recently wrote a book with Jamie Marich. It's called EMDR Therapy and Mindfulness for Trauma-Focused Care.
Dr. Steve's name may also sound familiar for other reasons. He's a frequent guest on Mark Maron's podcast, WTF with Mark Maron, and was a drummer in the art rock band King Missile.
You sourced that one out, did you?
Is there a reunion tour in the works? Or?
They're busy reuniting over and over again in New York while I'm out here in LA. So one day I'll make the trip. It's a long commute.
Or make them come here.
Yeah, there it is.
That's so great. Well, hi, Dr. Steve. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Carol gave us a brief description of EMDR therapy when she was telling us about her plane crash. Now, how does it work from the practitioner's side? You know, how do you lead people like Carol or someone who's been through a similar trauma through this kind of treatment?
So she gave a pretty good, very quick thumbnail description of it. And the way I could sort of stretch it out just a little bit for you is to describe it, which is that it's an 8-phase protocol. And it's based on something called the Adaptive Information Processing Model. And both of these were developed by Francine Shapiro, who developed the therapy. And what happened was she came across this eye movement, and then you heard Carol describe that other forms of bilateral stimulation like tactile or audio tones can be used. But she discovered how there seemed to be a desensitization of difficult memories. And then as she did it a little bit more and did some research, she found that it was doing more than that it was brain change was happening and reprocessing was happening, a little bit of kind of that change that Carol described. In the book that I just wrote with Jamie, you know, a lot of what we believe and what we've kind of gone forward with is this idea that mindfulness-based skills are best practice resourcing. And the idea is that also, and Carol alluded to this about how she doesn't have to go back to those memories, that this treatment is meant to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's related to, when I was a therapy client in New York, before I became a therapist, my therapist told me that a good therapist should have a lot of ex-clients. And what I found with EMDR therapy, and I got this from my first mentor in EMDR therapy, he said, people will come into your office. you will reprocess past memories, present triggers, and future fears, and they will thank you and they will leave. And sometimes they'll come back for touch-ups. Something happens new in their lives that kind of tickles some of that material, or new materials created. So that's been my experience over the years. I've been doing this for over 10 years, where I have people who, when I meet them, I say, wow, you seem like a really nice person, but I'm really hoping you're not sitting on that couch for a million years. I want you to feel better and go on.
Absolutely. Especially in Carol's case, when she was talking about with her family, they never really dealt with it at the time.
Yes.
And how much of that must have been internalized.
Absolutely.
It's very relatable.
Which puts more trauma on top of the trauma. So that's the other thing that Carol was really helpful to someone like myself, who's like trying to hear as much as I can, not just research, but like the anecdotal and other clinicians' experiences with clients, is that if you hear her story or read her story, it's not just a plane crashed, period, end of sentence. It's every single element of it, right? The nuances, which includes like the whole of the crash itself, and then the hospital visit after, and then the way her family did or did not deal with it. And all of that was just everyone doing the best they could under the circumstances. But in the end, what I'm treating in the office is not just, oh, you're in a plane crash and we're going to desensitize that and reprocess that memory. It's usually when you have a quote unquote event-based trauma like that, there's all kinds of events, sort of strewn throughout that memory. And then the other thing that we do is I don't assume it's, oh, the plane crash, okay, that's what we're doing. What we do is a thorough, what I was talking about before, a phase one, where it's like we're getting a history and we're seeing that, some people are more preloaded or front-loaded for the possibility of PTSD after something like this, and some people are not. There's different levels of resilience that people are born with, and then there's different levels of, let's say, past trauma histories, or even not trauma histories. We talk about in EMDR therapy, we talk about trauma and adverse life events. So like if I had a complicated relationship with a parent, for instance, and then an event-based trauma happens, there's a chance that those things will lock into each other below the level of consciousness, and on we go. And so that's what I'm assuming, her therapist did, which is, to get the full picture in order so that we know exactly what it is we're treating to get the best result.
So EMDR clearly works for a lot of folks, but I was doing a little research and I read that it only might work for certain types of trauma. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So you read about the haters.
Haters gonna hate.
It wasn't like hate. It was just more like it was research based. But anyway, the point being that, EMDR therapy, one of the most researched therapies on earth at this point, is evidence-based according to the World Health Organization and plenty of other organizations. But since 2014, evidence-based for PTSD. And of course, I'm a huge believer in one size does not fit all. But with this argument, when it comes to certain types of trauma, some of that might be, for a long time, it had this reputation as being like a miracle cure for event-based trauma, and that it doesn't necessarily work for complex trauma or complex PTSD or developmental trauma or attachment-based trauma. But the thing is, for the last 30 years, we've all been trying to figure out, like, does this work for that? And years ago, we discovered that it does. There are some what are called alternative protocols to the standard protocol, but most of those are just about really case conceptualization. They're not about like doing some special tricks or anything like that. It would go slower. So like with anything else, everyone's tune is changing. And myself and Jamie are sort of at the forefront of being loud about the fact that it works just fine, if not infinitely in an awesome fashion, with developmental trauma and attachment wounds and all the rest of it. I'm seeing it in my office, and I'm also training people in that model. Like Jamie and I, we train people in EMDR therapy, and when they go out in the world, they've received the message and they've integrated the idea that this can be used for those types of traumas, and it can also be used for other diagnoses and problems. And if a person has had a lot of adverse life events and no dedicated trauma, it's still the way to go. It's the maladaptive processing of memories. And so looking at that as the focus of treatment, right? Like in psychodynamic work, the focus of treatment is the transference, countertransference. In CBT, it's the maladaptive beliefs, and we manipulate those beliefs. In this therapy, it's that the maladaptively processed memories are brought to an adaptive resolution through this process. So that can be done with all kinds of memories, not just a plane crash or something similar.
Yeah, but life traumas. Absolutely. I mean, that's so true. That's why certain things sometimes trigger, sudden tears, because it's those deep pockets of trauma that you're going in and accessing and relieving. I'm sure over the years, there's been a lot of consistencies where you're like, yes, knew it. But have you ever had something really surprising in your findings?
If there's anything that surprised me, it was that no one has thought to make this journey into what Jamie and I are calling trauma-focused care sooner. And I'm also not surprised because there's been like a lot of pushback. Like when Francine Shapiro came up with the therapy, she immediately knew it's like eye movement desensitization. Carol even described that. She's like, yeah, don't keep that away from me, whatever that is, right?
Yeah.
It just sounds wonky and weird and to coin a phrase, but not coin a phrase, woo-woo, right?
Yes.
And then when she developed it, she found this therapy through her own mindfulness exploration that was related to her own cancer diagnosis. She actually got mindfulness training from Stephen Levine and others, a Buddhist teacher. So from the beginning, she's like, yeah, this is kind of a mindfulness thing, but I better not tell anybody because it's 1989 and everyone's going to say that I'm a hack, right?
A wackadoo.
A wackadoody,
Yeah.
snake oil sales lady, So she kept it kind of close to the vest and then got all this research done. And now she has been a little bit more upfront about it. And those of us who have noticed that, like I've been a Buddhist meditator for almost 30 years. And when I became a clinician, I was trained in EMDR almost immediately. Like I'm someone who got trained in EMDR therapy while I was still in my intern hours as a marriage and family therapist. And so from the beginning, I was like, this is a mindfulness thing. Now we're at this place where we can unsurprisingly say that seems to be one of the mechanisms of action. For instance, Carol actually talked about the REM sleep relationship, right? Those eye movements are actually a healing / processing device. So where basically one of the theorized mechanisms of action is that we're replicating that. And then the other ones are the orienting response. We're constantly scanning for danger. We're bringing up the terrible memory at the same time that we're doing the eye movements, which is representative of the 98 times out of 100 that there is no danger. Like it's boring. So all these things are activated together and it becomes boring, so to speak. And then there's right-left brain integration and another, the working memory theory, that it's taxing the working memory in a certain way that changes the way that we process the information. And then there's mindfulness, which has been posited since the beginning, but now we're talking about more. So the surprises are always coming. And then also the surprises that I get in my office with individual clients where I sit there and one of the major aspects of EMDR therapy is we're encouraged to stay out of the way as much as possible. That it's the client's own associative memory networks that are doing the healing, the same way you scrape your knee and it knows what to do, it scabs, it does all that and it heals. So I just start this protocol running and then I listen or watch to this thing happening and it's like, whoa, that's connected to that, that's connected to that. And I don't insert myself and go, hey, let's talk about that, because that would be selfish and stupid and actually screw the person up. So I just go, wow. So that's the other thing that makes it great doing the work that I do is I'm constantly surprised. And then even at the end of a session, I can be surprised, whoa, that worked again. That's weird.
Yeah, the human mind. It's an amazing thing.
So it seems like EMDR, it's getting more popular, but, a lot of folks might still be on the fence. So for our listeners, what would you want the main takeaway to be about EMDR therapy?
Going back to those listeners who respond to research and evidence, and the best that modern science has to offer is that the World Health Organization, the VA, all the branches of the military, anyone who's concerned with PTSD considers it frontline treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. Then people like myself who have a mindfulness background the way that I do and work with and teach EMDR the way that we do, I believe that it is a frontline treatment for the human condition and that it doesn't have to be about let's go reducing mental health stigma on this. You don't have to have a diagnosis to benefit from therapy. People have always said that. You really don't have to have a diagnosis to benefit from this. And if you do have a quote unquote diagnosis, then the reprocessing of your maladaptively stored memories can only help. So whether you find an EMDR therapist who is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs about the therapy like I am and uses it as the central therapy, or you find someone where it sounds like Carol's experience, that the person integrates EMDR into their other interventions that they do, regardless if the person is, well trained in this therapy and goes by, uses the protocol as their assistant, as it were, or their structure, then you're going to get relief. That's just been my experience. I would hope anyone who feels like they could use some of this help would seek it out.
Really fascinating. So Dr. Steven Danziger, aka Dr. Steve, he's a psychotherapist who specializes in EMDR therapy. And with Jamie Marich, he wrote the book EMDR Therapy and Mindfulness for Trauma-Focused Care. Check it out. Thank you so much, Dr. Steve, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor.
I'm so glad we got to chat with Dr. Steve. My interest was really piqued when we were going to interview Carol, and then he really broke it down in a way that made me even more interested in this kind of therapy.
Absolutely. And especially the way that he found EMDR, as coming from as a psychotherapist, working with patients and seeing the research and how it's really helping for the specific event. That's very relatable, where there's those long-term, more complex things, like, I don't have confidence about this. And then plane crash, like two very different types of trauma, one stretched out, one more of a shock.
Yeah.
And that they've had really great results. I thought it was so interesting about the study between the Prozac and EMDR with veterans.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was like, not surprised the EMDR worked because, pills can do so much. They're great.
They can do a little.
Yeah. I take some to go to sleep.
Mm-hmm.
Take others to wake up. No, but I think that has more lasting power.
Yeah,
than
totally.
Pills.
Prozac also, I guess, is like, it works for some folks, right? But then you also have to experiment and find the right thing and blah, blah, blah. And I think there's a lot of trial and error. And you have to have the right doctor with you. Hopefully will listen to you and work with you. And then you also have to be able to identify with yourself so you can tell the doctor properly. There's all these different variables. So I think with EMDR, yes, there's clearly going to be some, but probably that helped it be more effective, right? Because I think there's just that core part of trauma where you're just have to learn that you're not in danger 98 times out of 100.
Absolutely. And going back in that visceral memory of the event, I found my old binder of burned CDs from college, and I made a mix CD called Breakup Jams. And it was amazing to see what 14 cuts 19-year-old Jenna saw as healing. I was like, that's nuts. And I popped it in and I listened to it and I was like, oh, Fast Car by Tracy Chapman. This does feel real, right? I think Regulator was on there too, which is an interesting choice. But it is those things that kind of take you back to that moment. Like, oh yeah, I was really sad when I made this CD. And then every time I would play it, it would kind of take you right back to that same feeling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You mentioned how your body might react even if cognitively you know what's going on. So even my brain is all right, sometimes my body will react, or my heart, my feelings. I'm like, whoa, that was really weird. And so that super resonated with me, right? We can't hide from our problems. And I guess if we do talk about how, hurt people, what do we do as hurt people for us to overcome that so we don't pass it on to other people? So instead of us using it as an excuse, we should be able to have more tools available so we can face what we've been through and maybe what we've done ourselves.
Absolutely. Healed people don't hurt people.
Yeah, and don't use someone else's past hurt as an excuse to not acknowledge, the harm that they've caused. I think that can't be underscored enough.
Totally. We're not cavemen anymore, right? Yeah, we're grown-ups. Yeah, take responsibility.
Take responsibility. I know it's hard.
Yeah. Find that form of healing that you need, and he found it through, I think, mindfulness and meditation. He was mentioning about, his Buddhist background, and it really makes sense.
Yeah, mindfulness really worked for me too, actually.
Yeah.
I had a therapist who recommended I meditate, and I was like, oh my God, I've tried this. Like, it just doesn't work because like the only kinds I heard is like sit in an hour in the corner with your mind completely blank. And I was like, that is just not happening. I have ADD. Like, it's just not
shit to do. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I was like, this is not going to happen. But then she told me about mindfulness, and I was like, oh, I like this. And it helps me like be more relaxed. I practice radical acceptance. What about you?
Yes. You have to these days.
Yeah. And for people who don't know, radical acceptance is basically knowing that you can't change certain things and you just kind of have to make do with it. So what really taught me was when I was in traffic, and you're in traffic and you're going to be late to something and you can't go any faster. So instead of me sitting there for 2 hours in my car being upset, like, oh my God, I can't believe it's like, oh my God, I hate traffic. I was like, all right, well, I'm here. Let me put on my favorite podcast.
Yeah. Instead of freaking out and
Right.
it just makes sense.
Right, because why should I make myself miserable? Like, the whole world already makes me miserable, so let me not join them.
Yeah. I think about that too. The older I get, the slower I drive. I found that too. I'm like, speed limit, you got it. You know,
Right.
I'm just like, I don't need to die on the road today.
You're like, isn't that limit a little high side?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Exactly. And that's it for this episode. Thank you to Carol E. Miller and to Dr. Steve Danziger for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this episode of iSurvivor. If you did, subscribe right now on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this now.
If you're listening on a smartphone, tap or swipe the cover art of this podcast. You'll find the episode notes, including some details you may have missed. You'll also find our email address there, iSurvivor@wondery.com, and links to our Facebook group and social media profiles. We'd love to hear your stories.
Another way you can support the show is by filling out a small survey at wondery.com/survey. It will help us make the show better for listeners like you. And who doesn't want that? This episode is hosted by me, Jenna Brister, and Wagatwe Wanjuki. Audio engineering by Sergio Enriquez. Sound design by Bay Area Sound. Produced by Leah Sutherland. Executive produced by Abby Fentress Swanson. Executive produced by Marshall Louie and Hernan Lopez for Wondery.